is A+++, calling the affordability crisis a hoax. These are things that the American people just know aren't true. He's lying. House Republicans are lying. They know that. They know that the affordability crisis is at their doorstep. They know it is more difficult to live under the Trump economy than it was previously. And they're holding him accountable. And that's coming through, not just in public polling, but it's coming through in our elections. In every election that we've seen, special elections from last night to Iowa months and months ago, to everything in between, New Jersey, Virginia, Mississippi, Georgia, I mean, all of these, Republicans continue to underperform because they have no real solutions. They won't solve the affordability crisis. They're only making it.
You just watched Pete Aguilar dismantle the entire Republican lie machine in real time, and what you're witnessing in this moment is nothing less than the unraveling of authoritarian gaslighting dressed up as economic policy, a moral catastrophe playing out in full view, where a political party controlled by an aspiring despot tells struggling Americans that their lived reality of crushing grocery bills and impossible rent and wages that can't keep pace with basic survival needs is somehow a hoax, a con job, a fake narrative invented by Democrats rather than the daily horror show playing out in their bank accounts. Because here's what's happening, and you need to understand the historical weight of this moment before we dive into the absolutely devastating political implications that are about to flip this country's power structure completely on its head. President Trump, at a Pennsylvania rally just days ago, called affordability a Democratic hoax and then referred to it as a con job and a scam perpetuated by Democrats, and this isn't some slip of the tongue or casual dismissiveness. This represents the fundamental contempt that Republican power brokers have for working people, the barely concealed disdain of oligarchs who genuinely cannot fathom why anyone would complain about prices when the stock market keeps climbing and their billionaire friends keep getting richer. Each month, the typical U.S. household must now spend $208 more than they did in September 2024 to buy the same goods and services, which amounts to almost $2,500 in increased costs per year. Trump successfully tapped into anger over the cost of living in the 2024 election and promised voters he would swiftly bring down prices, but now that he's back in power, watch how quickly the script flips. Watch how the very crisis he weaponized becomes suddenly invisible. The moment addressing it would require actual governing rather than campaign rhetoric. Aguilar stands there telling absolute truth to authoritarian power when he says they're lying, and the American people know they're lying because just 21% of U.S. adults in November described current economic conditions as excellent or good, down from 24% in October, and the lowest percentage since March, and economic confidence has dropped to a 17-month low, with 2/3 saying the economy was getting worse. And here's the bombshell that should terrify every Republican operative watching the special election returns roll in. Republicans won a special congressional election in Tennessee by only 9 points in a district the Republican candidate won by 22 points last year, in line with double-digit overperformances by Democrats in elections this year, and Democrats have done 14 points better on average than candidates in 2024, which means something absolutely seismic is happening in the American electorate right now, a reckoning that recalls the midterm backlashes that toppled overreaching majorities throughout our democratic history from 1994 to 2006 to 2010 to 2018. The pattern of special elections predicting electoral waves is ironclad political science, and special elections are one of the single best barometers for deciphering the electoral mood of the country and are excellent predictors of future political outcome. And what they're telling us right now is that voters are rejecting the party of Trump in district after district after district when they're forced to confront the actual consequences of Republican governance versus Republican promises. Let's talk about what's really happening beneath the surface of Trump's affordability hoax rhetoric, because this goes so much deeper than bad messaging or political incompetence. This represents the logical endpoint of movement conservatism's decades-long project to gaslight working Americans about whose interests the party actually serves. Inflation has edged higher in recent months, partly due to the Trump administration's tariffs, which means Trump's own policies are actively making the crisis worse, while he simultaneously denies the crisis exists, a totalitarian doublethink that would make Orwell weep. Trump's claim that affordability doesn't mean anything to anybody is an insult to the millions of American families who are struggling to pay their bills and keep food on the table, and this insult carries particular sting because it comes from a supposed populist who built his entire political identity on channeling working-class rage, except now the rage is directed back at him, as Americans realize they've been scammed by a con man selling them economic nationalism, while delivering oligarchic plunder. The intellectual architecture of Republican disinformation on economics deserves our scrutiny here, because what we're watching is not random dishonesty, but systematic ideological manipulation designed to preserve elite power structures against democratic accountability. When Trump and his propagandists claim the affordability crisis is a hoax, they're drawing from a deep well of right-wing denialism that stretches back through climate change denial and COVID denial and welfare queen myth-making, all the way to the original sin of supply-side economics, that magnificent lie that told working Americans their interests aligned with cutting taxes for the wealthy and deregulating industries that exploit them. Biden had help causing the affordability crisis, including from Trump during his first term, and he's not fixing it, he's making it worse, with Trump claiming, "I'm fixing it," despite rising costs. And what you're seeing here is the authoritarian's eternal tactic of taking credit for imaginary victories while blaming predecessors for ongoing disasters. Except Americans actually live in the economy and know whether their dollars stretch further or contract with each passing month. Watch how Aguilar systematically destroys the Republican electoral position by pointing to the evidence right in front of our faces. Democratic candidates have outperformed Kamala Harris's margins in the 2024 presidential race by an average of 16 percentage points in House special elections this year. Democrats won a state Senate special election in Iowa with a 25-point swing in the margin, compared with 2024, and a 16-point swing helped Democrats flip a key state Senate seat in Pennsylvania. And these aren't marginal shifts in safe Democratic territory. These represent fundamental realignments in the types of districts that determine congressional control. The Republicans are hemorrhaging support in real time, as voters who gave Trump a chance to deliver on his promises realize he never intended to keep them, that the whole affordability focus was always just a vehicle for seizing power, rather than a genuine commitment to economic justice. Here's where the moral stakes become absolutely crucial, because what Trump is doing when he calls affordability a hoax isn't just bad politics or clumsy messaging, it's an act of profound cruelty against vulnerable people, a dismissal of real suffering that carries the stench of aristocratic contempt for the peasantry. Dismissing affordability as a scam is impossible to square with official economic statistics, independent research, alternative measures, and public polling, which means Trump knows he's lying, his advisors know they're lying, the entire Republican establishment knows they're lying, and they're making a calculated bet that they can gaslight enough Americans into doubting their own lived experience of economic pain. This represents one of the most dangerous authoritarian moves in the playbook, because once you can convince people to distrust their own material reality, you've severed the connection between democratic governance and popular sovereignty. You've created a political universe where the leaders' pronouncements matter more than objective facts. The electoral consequences are already materializing, and they're going to get so much worse for Republicans as we hurtle toward the 2026 midterms, because voters don't forget being told their legitimate grievances are imaginary. While GOP wins were expected in both Florida districts, Democrats narrowed the margins considerably from November, and the narrowing margins may signal a shift in public sentiment, driven by unusually strong enthusiasm as Democrats from across the country poured millions into the races. And what's fueling that enthusiasm is precisely the sense that Republicans lied to them about fixing their economic problems and now won't even acknowledge those problems exist. Republicans confronting a new reality are not only facing political headwinds as the party in power, but simultaneously grappling with a dramatic reversal in the partisan preferences of the country's most reliable voters, which means the coalition Trump assembled is already fracturing as the very working-class voters who delivered him power realize they've been betrayed by someone who promised them economic relief, but delivered only scorn for their continued suffering. Think about the philosophical implications of a political party telling citizens that affordability crises are hoaxes, while simultaneously proposing policy solutions for those same crises. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that position reveals the intellectual bankruptcy of contemporary conservatism. Trump said during a cabinet meeting, "There's this fake narrative that the Democrats talk about affordability, and it doesn't mean anything to anybody." Yet, Trump also said, "I have no higher priority than making America affordable again, and we're bringing them down," which exposes the contradictions at the heart of Republican economic messaging. They want credit for addressing a crisis they claim doesn't exist, because they understand voters know it exists, but they refuse to implement actual solutions that would threaten donor-class interests. This is late-stage capitalism's political expression, a governing coalition so thoroughly captured by plutocratic power that it literally cannot acknowledge economic suffering without undermining its own ideological foundations. Aguilar's genius in this moment lies in his refusal to let Republicans have it both ways. in his insistence that the emperor is naked and the American people can see his nakedness regardless of how many times Fox News tells them his clothing is magnificent. When he says they know that the affordability crisis is at their doorstep, and they know it is more difficult to live under the Trump economy than it was previously, he's stating the obvious, but in our current political moment, stating the obvious becomes a revolutionary act when one party has committed itself to systematic reality denial. Trump has dismissed Democrats' focus on cost of living issues, saying affordability is a con job and doesn't mean anything to anybody, but Schumer and Jeffries watched the crushing weight of inflation under former President Biden drag down their party in 2024, so Democrats learned the brutal lesson about ignoring economic pain, and they're not going to let Republicans evade accountability for ignoring it now. The special election results tell a story that should strike terror into every Republican strategist's heart, because they reveal that Trump's electoral magic has vanished the moment he took office, and voters could judge him on governance rather than grievance. Republicans can explain away the troubling Tennessee special election results any way they want, but what about the dozens of other special elections in 2025 that saw the party underperform? And this pattern isn't random statistical noise. It's the electorate sending unmistakable signals that they feel duped, and they're looking for revenge at the ballot box. Polls have found Latino voters have soured on Trump because of his handling of the economy. In New Jersey and Virginia gubernatorial races, Latinos voted 2-1 in favor of Democratic candidates, which represents a catastrophic erosion of the gains Trump made with non-white working-class voters in 2024. The exact constituency Republicans told themselves would realign American politics for a generation. Let's examine the class dimensions of this crisis, because Republican dismissal of affordability concerns isn't class-neutral. It represents the interests of people for whom inflation means slightly smaller returns on investment portfolios rather than choosing between groceries and rent. Trump lives in literal gold-plated penthouse suites and claims to understand the struggles of people working multiple jobs to afford eggs. The absurdity would be comedic if it weren't so tragic, and if Republican economic policies weren't actively enriching the wealthy while impoverishing workers. Rep. Skolton said, "The only people who don't realize that are the out-of-touch billionaires that the president continues to put before American families, and this gets at the fundamental material reality that Republican governance serves capital, not labor, serves ownership, not workers, serves the people who profit from inflation, not the people crushed by it." The affordability hoax rhetoric makes perfect sense once you understand that Republican elites genuinely don't experience the affordability crisis and therefore struggle to believe it's real for others. Their bubble of privilege has become so impermeable that working-class economic suffering registers as political theater rather than material fact. Aguilar's point about special election results from Iowa to Virginia to Mississippi to Georgia provides empirical validation for what progressives have argued for years, that when voters face clear choices between Republican rhetoric and Democratic policy, they choose policy every time. Republicans will need to defend much more vulnerable seats if they have any hope of keeping their House majority, while Democrats are capitalizing on President Donald Trump's unpopularity and the public's persistent frustration with the economy. And here's where the 2026 outlook becomes absolutely devastating for the GOP, because Democrats need to gain 3 seats to get to 218 in the House, and a Democratic overperformance even close to recent special election results would be enough to deliver them the majority. The Republicans' paper-thin margins in both chambers mean even modest swings produce control-flipping consequences, and the swings we're seeing aren't modest, they're tidal. The historical parallels to previous midterm waves deserve attention here, because American democracy has repeatedly corrected overreaching presidents through the electoral mechanism of backlash. From LBJ's Great Society producing the conservative turn of 1968, to Reagan's Revolution generating 1982, Democratic gains to Gingrich's contract with America, producing Clinton's 1996 re-election to Bush's war on terror, enabling the 2006 Democratic takeover to the Tea Party, producing Obama's 2010 losses to Trump's first term, generating the 2018 blue wave. The party that wins the White House historically loses seats in midterm cycles that follow, and voters have become increasingly willing to back split government. And what we're witnessing now suggests 2026 could exceed even the historic swings of previous wave elections, because Trump's betrayal of his core economic promises to working-class voters represents perhaps the most cynical bait-and-switch in modern political history. He ran explicitly on making America affordable again, and now claims the affordability crisis is a hoax. That's not normal political repositioning, that's contempt for the electorate disguised as governing philosophy. The Republican response to this crisis reveals everything you need to know about their priorities, because rather than actually addressing affordability, they're doubling down on denial and hoping voters somehow forget their grocery bills between now and Election Day. Following dismal results for Republicans in off-cycle elections, the White House has sought to convince voters that the economy will emerge stronger next year and that anxieties over inflation have nothing to do with Trump, but the overall inflation rate has climbed since he announced broad tariffs in April. So the crisis isn't imaginary, and it isn't Democrats' fault, and voters aren't stupid enough to believe otherwise, no matter how many times Trump's propagandists repeat the lie. Trump has continued to insist that the economy is better than ever, but this approach carries risks, as President Joe Biden learned when he ignored inflation and scrambled to minimize the political fallout of losing trust with the public, which means Democrats have recent painful experience with dismissing economic anxieties, and they're not going to let Republicans forget that dismissiveness has consequences. Here's what makes this moment so pregnant with transformative possibility. The convergence of economic suffering and Republican denial is creating precisely the conditions for mass political mobilization that progressive movements need to fundamentally reshape American politics. When people feel gaslit by those in power, they don't just vote against them, they organize against them, they donate against them, they volunteer against them, they pour their anger and betrayal into collective action that can move mountains. The suspense in Florida's 6th District is whether Democrats can take a bite out of giant Trump margins and claim political momentum, particularly where Democrat Josh Weil outraised Republican Randy Fine by a staggering margin, and early voting hinted at an energized Democratic base, a pattern in special elections during the Trump era. And that energized base isn't appearing from nowhere, it's being activated by the stark realization that Trump sold them a bill of goods and now won't even acknowledge their suffering under his policies. The institutional implications of Republicans controlling government while denying the affordability crisis extend beyond electoral politics into questions of democratic legitimacy itself, because government loses its moral authority when it refuses to acknowledge citizens' material conditions. Think about what it means for a president to stand before the American people and tell them their experience of economic pain is imaginary, while simultaneously claiming credit for solving that imaginary problem. That's not democratic leadership, that's authoritarian doublespeak. Trump fumes even at the word affordability, regarding it as a democratic hoax, and is wallowing in denial about an economy that he claims has entered a golden age, but that is making many working and middle-class Americans feel poorer. And this denial isn't sustainable because material reality eventually overwhelms propaganda. Empty stomachs and overdue bills don't disappear just because the president says they should. Aguilar's specific citations of underperformance across multiple states and multiple election cycles builds an irrefutable case that something fundamental has shifted in American politics since Trump returned to office, that the permission structure voters gave themselves to support him based on economic promises has collapsed now that those promises revealed themselves as hollow. Republican candidates are not echoing Trump's language, as the Republican candidate in Tennessee made specifics about cost of living a key part of his closing message. But that messaging didn't stave off double-digit Democratic gains in a high-turnout election, and the economic tide is clearly against Republicans right now, which means even Republicans running in Trump country understand they can't run on Trump's affordability hoax messaging, because voters in their districts are living the crisis daily and won't tolerate having their reality denied. The progressive infrastructure that's being built through these special elections will pay dividends far beyond 2026, because every close race generates volunteer networks and donor relationships and organizing capacity that persists into future cycles. Democrats are learning how to run everywhere and contest everything and nationalize elections around Republican cruelty and failure, the exact playbook that delivered them the House in 2018 and could deliver them trifecta control in 2028. If current trends continue, Republicans' challenge of turning out the Trump coalition when the president isn't on the ballot is becoming clear as special elections and off-cycle elections continue to be a problem without a change of strategy, and there's no strategy that can solve the fundamental problem that Trump voters showed up specifically to vote for Trump, not for Trumpism. They wanted the personality cult, not the policy agenda, and now that the policy agenda has betrayed them, they're staying home or switching sides. The moral urgency of this moment cannot be overstated, because we're watching in real time whether American democracy can course-correct when voters recognize they've been deceived by authoritarian populism, or whether we're locked into a trajectory of decline, regardless of electoral outcomes. The special elections suggest democracy still works, that accountability still matters, that voters still have agency to punish politicians who lie to them about fundamental kitchen table economics. Trump faces an almost impossible task in trying to convince Americans the affordability crisis they experience each day doesn't exist. After all, candidate Trump told them it does. And this contradiction eviscerates his credibility because voters remember his promises, even if he wishes they'd forget. They remember him at McDonald's claiming to understand their struggles, even as President Trump now tells them those struggles are Democratic propaganda. Watch what happens over the next 18 months as these electoral dynamics accelerate and compound, as more Republicans face voters in districts where Trump's margins are evaporating, as Democratic energy builds toward a level we haven't seen since the resistance peak of 2017-2018, as the material conditions of working-class life continue grinding people down, while Republican politicians tell them everything is fine. Although inflation has dropped since Biden was in office, Democratic candidate Ben focused her campaign on lingering concerns about prices, but Trump played down the affordability issue, saying during a cabinet meeting it was a con job by his political opponents, and there's this fake narrative that the Democrats talk about, affordability, so the battle lines are drawn with perfect clarity. Democrats saying we see your pain and we're fighting to address it, versus Republicans saying your pain is imaginary, and anyone claiming otherwise is lying to you. That's not a difficult choice for voters struggling to survive. The broader ideological collapse of Republican economics that this moment represents will reshape American politics for a generation, because once working-class voters recognize that the party promising to fight for them actually holds them in contempt, that the populist rebellion was always just oligarchic plunder with better marketing, that recognition doesn't fade quickly or easily. Trump has burned the bridge that connected Republicans to the multiracial working-class coalition he assembled in 2024, and there's no obvious path to rebuilding it, because the contradiction between Republican rhetoric and Republican governance has become too glaring to obscure. You can't simultaneously claim to be the party of working people while telling working people their economic struggles are hoaxes invented by your opponents. The cognitive dissonance eventually breaks the coalition. Aguilar stands there embodying the moral clarity that progressives need to sustain through the coming battles, the unflinching willingness to call lies lies, and to trust that voters will reward honesty about economic conditions over gaslighting about economic fantasies. When he says Republicans are lying and Americans know they're lying, he's performing the essential democratic function of creating counter-narratives to authoritarian propaganda, of insisting that objective reality still matters even when those in power try to obliterate it. The special election results vindicate his framing because they demonstrate that voters do know they're being lied to, and they're punishing Republicans for that dishonesty district by district by district across the country. The endgame here could reshape American governance fundamentally if Democrats seize the opportunity this Republican collapse creates, if they run everywhere on economic populism and accountability and material improvement of working people's lives, if they force Republicans to defend the indefensible position that affordability crises are hoaxes while Americans can't afford basic necessities. Rep. Pete Aguilar said Republicans see the writing on the wall, and it's a mess over there, as they're fighting amongst themselves right now. An internal Republican chaos will only intensify as the 2026 races approach and vulnerable members start breaking from Trump to save themselves, creating fractures that Democrats can exploit to pass actual legislation addressing the affordability crisis once they retake power. The Republican Party's commitment to denying economic reality while working Americans suffer will be remembered as the moment they forfeited their claim to populist credibility and opened the door for genuine progressive economic transformation. This is the inflection point where history bends if we have the courage to bend it.